Carrot flies are one of the trickiest pests that I've had to deal with in the vegetable gardens. Or at least it's taken me the longest to consistently prevent the larva from this fly from damaging so many of the carrots that I grow. With this pest, a small error at the wrong time can lead to a lot of damage to many roots, especially with the late season storage crop of carrots that we rely on to feed ourselves through the winter. This year I successfully prevented any carrot fly damage in the full bed of carrots in 3 of the main gardens. It seems I needed a number of different strategies working together to finally avoid the damage from this pest. When I first started these gardens, I didn't have any issues with carrot flies, because no one in the area had been growing carrots, so the background population of this fly was probably very low. I can't remember when I started seeing the damage from the burrowing larvae in the carrot roots, but suddenly one year there seemed to be damage to most of the carrots I had grown. Because I didn't do anything about this pest for the first few years, I allowed the population to increase by feeding them the carrots that I grew. I was essentially breeding this pest through my lack of knowledge and action, and I've been trying to reduce the population of this pest in and around the gardens ever since. I have tried a few different methods in different gardens over the years, including interplanting with onions and using garlic sprays to either deter or confuse the flies. I also tried delaying sowing the carrot seeds in the spring to try to avoid the first generation of this pest, and tried to sow really thinly to avoid the need for thinning, but I didn't have much success with any of these methods, or at least I wasn't consistent enough in applying them. And I eventually found that using a barrier to prevent the flies from getting at the carrot plants by covering them with a fine mesh worked best, or had a better chance of succeeding. This type of mesh is quite expensive, but it should last many years if I look after it, and theoretically it should be very effective. But I've not always been successful, and have had quite a few crops that were seriously infested by the larvae even though I had used the netting. In some cases I probably put the cover on too late, after the flies had already laid their eggs on the soil at the base of the carrot seedlings. In other cases the cover moved during the season, creating a gap at the edge that I didn't see or fix in time. The flies could also have gotten in while I thinned the seedlings or weeded the bed. And it is possible that the flies found one of the numerous holes in the netting that were often made by the claws of larger birds, or when dogs, foxes, or cats ran across the beds. I used to think that it was unlikely that flies like this would find such small holes, but then I realized that if no other carrots or other suitable plants are around, the flies will keep trying to get through the mesh. They had nothing else to do but try to fulfill their biological imperative of laying eggs close to the base of a suitable plant. Even if one carrot fly gets past the barrier and into the crop, it can apparently lay up to 100 eggs. And if it's early enough in the season, any of these eggs that are able to develop into the next generation of flies will be trapped in with the carrots. With the long season main crop carrots that I grow, it is likely the larva from the second generation of flies that causes so much damage. I've had large batches of carrots where almost every root I pulled out of the ground in the autumn had carrot fly larva damage, which was really demoralizing. And in many cases, these larvae will continue to eat the roots while in storage, causing even more damage the longer they are stored. So for this year, I was determined to do everything that I could to try to get good crops of carrots without any damage from carrot fly larvae. I sowed good quality seed fairly thinly so that it would reduce the amount of thinning I would need to do later, or at least to allow the seedlings to grow bigger before I needed to thin them. I flame weeded the bed before any of the carrot seeds germinated to reduce the amount of weeding that I would need to do later, and then I covered the bed with a fine mesh immediately after that, raising it up off the soil with wire hoops, mainly to reduce the chance of damage from birds and other animals. I weighed down the edge of the mesh with stones and a line of municipal compost to make sure that there were not any gaps where the flies might be able to get in. As the plants grew, I did some occasional spot weeding by carefully reaching under the edge of the netting, but I made sure to secure the edge with compost afterwards. When I thinned the carrots and did a proper full weeding, I tried to reduce the amount of netting that I pulled up to reduce the chance of any carrot fly getting in while I worked. And I did this weeding and thinning on a windy day, as apparently these carrot flies are quite weak flyers, and I figured there was less of a chance of them moving around when there was a strong wind. Later in the season, the carrot tops in 2 of the gardens grew really big, and started to pull up the mesh at the edges, so I decided to use bent pieces of wire to pin it to the ground at regular intervals. This was reasonably successful at keeping it secure, but there were a few places where a gap appeared, especially when the foliage started to lean to one side. I just hoped that it was late enough in the season that the carrot flies were not around. I also regularly checked the mesh for holes, and found that I could easily repair or close most of them by running my fingernail gently back and forth across the plastic threads to try to realign them. This worked quite well, in combination with carefully stretching the mesh in different directions in some cases. In a few places where the threads had been ripped or torn or the hole was just too big, I patched the netting by sewing a scrap piece over the hole. All of this was an extra task to remember to do on a regular basis, and it did take time, and to be honest, I'm not sure how important or effective it was at keeping the carrot fly out. I also don't know how big a hole needed to be for a fly to get in, but it did feel like an important part of general maintenance of this mesh netting, to keep this expensive material in good shape so it would hopefully last longer. And if this kept even one fly out of the carrots, it was probably worth the effort. I don't really know the details of the timing of the life cycle of this pest here in Ireland, or more specifically when the adult flies might be out in the gardens trying to lay their eggs, and it's something that I've tried to investigate more this year. I sowed carrot seeds in pots and let them grow in a propagation space for a while, and then set them out in the gardens for about a month, exposing them to any carrot flies that might be around at that time. Then I put them under cover and waited for any eggs and larvae to develop, before checking to see if there was any damage. I tried to repeat this every month to keep a batch of pots out in the gardens from spring through to autumn. The pots that were exposed in March and April didn't have any larvae in them, but the batches that were exposed in May, June, July, and in August all had damage from carrot fly larvae, and then by September the roots were clear again. As I'm already using the mesh as a barrier, the details don't matter that much, but it would be good to narrow the dates down a bit so that I can plan any thinning or weeding for when the carrot flies are less likely to be around. I was quite fortunate with the late weeding and thinning of a batch of carrots in the extensive garden, which I finally got around to in mid-July. Because there was so much growth, I felt that I needed to take the risk and pull back the mesh while I worked. And thankfully, this seemed to have been done at a time when there were no carrot flies around searching for a suitable place to lay their eggs. I assumed that this was after the first generation of flies had already laid their eggs in late spring, but before the second generation of flies had emerged to lay their eggs later in the summer. When I was done checking all of the carrots in the pots for larvae, I put them in the center of a hot compost to kill any larvae that were there. By doing this, I was essentially using these pots of carrot seedlings as a trap crop. These pots, scattered around the gardens, gave any carrot flies a convenient place to lay their eggs, and were less likely to try to get into the crop of carrots under the mesh barrier that I was trying to protect. Because I was regularly replacing the pots with a fresh batch and killing off the older batches, I was probably reducing the population of this pest rather than breeding a new generation. I was trying to do the same thing with a few batches of carrots in the polyculture garden that I left uncovered, allowing them to become a sacrificial crop. But I likely failed to remove and destroy them in time, so I probably helped to increase the population of this pest with these carrots. I think the sacrificial crop is perhaps the critical missing part of the widespread idea of interplanting carrots with onions in order to deter the carrot fly. I suspect this companion planting approach originated in an allotment site or someplace where there was lots of different growers, where someone planted carrots close to onions and noticed that they had a lot less damage from this pest than their neighbor who grew carrots and onions farther apart. So it was appropriate to come to the conclusion that the smell of the onions either deterred or repelled a carrot fly. But I suspect that this deterrence of the onions might only work if there is a sacrificial crop of carrots nearby. If there's nothing else available, then I suspect that the carrot fly will eventually make their way to the carrots between the onions. This is what I think happened with a few trials in the polyculture garden a few years ago, where I had sown carrots between established onion plants, but they still ended up with lots of larva damage. I now believe that this was because they were the only carrots in the area that were not covered by a mesh barrier. They were effectively the sacrificial crop. So I think that the success I had at eliminating the pest from the main batches of carrots this year is because I used an effective barrier in combination with a trap or sacrificial crop. The mesh barrier was put in place early enough, secured around the edges, and kept off the ground to reduce any damage from animals. I regularly checked this mesh and repaired any holes, and tried to avoid lifting too much of the cover when thinning, weeding, or harvesting. Thankfully, the carrot flies were not laying eggs when I took the risk of removing the mesh entirely when weeding and thinning the carrots of that one garden. The pots of carrot seedlings that I spread around the gardens provided a bit of information about the life cycle of this pest that will be useful in the future, and they also served as a trap crop, providing a place for the flies to lay their eggs. And the uncovered batches of carrots in the polyculture garden also seemed to pull the flies away from the crops that I wanted to keep. In the future, I plan to sow patches of sacrificial carrots beside the main crops of carrots that I want to keep in all of the gardens. But I need to make sure that I remove and destroy these trap crops early enough to avoid accidentally breeding more of this pest. It is great to have lots of really good carrots to harvest this year, especially as the past few years have been quite demoralizing. I haven't harvested the full crops of carrots yet, but I haven't seen any carrot fly larvae in any of the roots. And even if there is a bit of damage somewhere, it's going to be much less than in previous years. There was also full germination of the seeds in the 3 gardens, and no significant damage from slugs earlier in the spring, and no damage from rats later in the season, which has been a big problem in the past. It has also been a really good growing season for a root crop like this, and I've been pulling up quite a few really large carrots. Some of them possibly grew too big. With all of that, this is possibly the best crop of carrots I've ever grown, and there will be loads of carrots for storage and enough to share with friends and neighbors. Assuming that I can continue to have success with preventing damage from this pest next year, I want to start to properly explore some other issues about growing carrots. I want to get back to doing a proper variety trial and to explore the timing and spacing of these plants, and to see if I can improve the taste of the carrots through better soil and fertility management. And it would be great if I could finally figure out how to prevent the roots of the carrots in some of the gardens from forking and splitting so much.